Now, many leaders of developing nations left COP feeling disappointed that they didn't witness bigger commitments from the wealthy nations to do more to address climate change. For many, the crisis is a lot more than a threat. They're already living with the consequences of global warming. And while they contribute the least to the problem, they are paying a high price. So despite being responsible for less than 1% of global carbon emissions, small island developing states are on the front line of climate change. Some nations have been left in debt from dealing with increasing climate impacts, such as extreme weather. For example, in 2017, Dominica lost 226% of its GDP to the impacts of Hurricane Maria. It's why at COP26, countries and small islands called on wealthier nations to meet their pledge on climate finance and pledge to provide $100 billion every year to fund mitigation and adaptation. Now, this pledge was missed and it won't be met until 2023. Well, joining me now to tell us more is the founder of Island Innovation, James Ellsmoor. So welcome to you. And let's start with the money. How important is that climate finance? $100 billion promised in 2009 won't be forthcoming until 2023. How important is it to those vulnerable nations, and what's its delay meant?
That money is absolutely vital. I would argue that 100 billion that was promised was not really sufficient in the first place. It's quite a round number, and a lot of the quality of the money that's already been received has been made in the form of loans, which add to this issue of debt. But obviously, as has already been mentioned, small island developing states are the most vulnerable to climate change, as are many other developing nations. And they are not the people, they're not the countries that are causing the issue. And so for me, there's a moral imperative for wealthier nations to help finance the adaptation for these islands to avoid the worst impacts of climate change for their populations.
Well, yes, because what exactly is the money intended for? Is it about them moving away from fossil fuels, or is it about that adaptation that you talk about?
Well, there's two parts. There's the mitigation and the adaptation, and often those things are part and parcel of the same thing. For example, renewable energy projects could be both mitigation, reducing carbon emissions, but also adaptation, helping to make those countries less vulnerable to impacts of climate change. Projects such as sea walls to protect from hurricanes would be considered adaptation. So there's a whole range of different projects that impact food security, water, energy, et cetera, that this money needs to go to really ensure that climate change will impact these countries, but it's to reduce the level of impact and ultimately the impact on human lives in those countries.
And what about the area of loss and damage? Because there are a number of countries who say we've already suffered damage and we think that those most polluting countries should be the ones to pay for it. Have they made any progress with that argument?
Absolutely. There's this widespread argument that the most polluting countries should be paying for vulnerable countries. There was some progress at COP. It was not nearly enough. And what I think will be interesting in the year ahead, as the UK hands over its presidency to Egypt, which is itself a developing nation, itself an extremely vulnerable nation to climate change, if that will shift the narrative and the emphasis that we see as we move towards COP27 later this year. There were important commitments made, such as the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States Fund. The UK government contributed a total of 10 million to that fund. There was also the Small Island Developing States Capacity and Resilience Programme, which the UK government contributed a further £40 million to. But in the grand scheme of things, these are quite small numbers. And what is the concern by many countries is not just that the money is not reaching them, but the quality of the funding, the limitations or the forms that that funding is taking is not adequate.
Well, James Ellsmoor, very interesting to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.